So we are joined today by Nick Kemp. Nick is the founder of IKIGAI Tribe, and we're going to be hearing a lot more about that, I'm sure, as we go through this conversation. So welcome to this episode, Nick.
Neil and Sonia, thank you so much for having me, and yeah, really excited about what we can share on this call.
So for those of the listeners who don't know Nick Kemp, can you give us a little bit of an insight into what Ikigai is for you and kind of how your story kind of evolved to this point?
Sure. I mean, it really goes back to when I was living in Japan, and this was in 1998, and a Japanese co-worker, where we were out on a lunch break, and this is when I'd returned to Japan after previously living there for a year. So I went in 1995 and worked as a trainee chef, and then went back home after that year, and then a few years later wanted to go back, and so I got a teaching job like many people. And then I was back in Japan, really excited, started working at this school, and on a lunch break, a coworker asked me, "Oh, Nick, what's your ikigai in Japanese?" And I'm like, "Ikigai, what's that?" And she's said, "Oh, it's the things that make your life worth living, but it's also, the reason you battle on in life." And I thought it was fascinating. And I still have a very vivid memory. I could go back to the exact spot where this coworker asked me this question. And then I did the first thing everyone else does when they learn a fascinating word. I went to my coworkers and said, "Oh, there's this word, ikigai, and it means this." And it was one of these words that I remembered on first hearing. When you're in Japan and you're learning the language, you forget all these words, and many of them are difficult to remember or difficult to say. But back then there was really no internet, and there certainly weren't any best-selling books on Ikigai at the time. So I guess it took up some space in the back of my mind. And then, my connection to Japan is very strong. I lived there for 10 years. My wife's from Japan. It's a second home to me. Japan's been, very good to me. It's given me all these opportunities. So I definitely have a love and respect for the culture. And I mean, we were going back every couple of years. We were going back last year, but couldn't because of obviously the pandemic. And then my connection to Ikigai really strengthened or sort of reappeared with the Venn diagram that I saw online all the time. And I mean, the first time I saw it, I thought, that's very unusual because Japanese would never define a word like that. And to the Japanese, it's a word they grow up with, and it's not a special word as such. So I thought, oh, it must be like a Western interpretation, and forgot about it. Then I saw it again and again, and then the best-selling book came out. And then I think when I saw it on the World Health Organization website, I thought, right, I've got to do something about this. Because there was a little voice inside me sort of saying, "Nick, you've got to do something about this. You've got to correct this misinterpretation." And so about 2.5 years ago, all I really knew was, okay, it's not this Venn diagram. It has a far sort of deeper and broader meaning, but I really didn't know anything about it. So that's when I started reaching out to Japanese professors and authors, and I started with my podcast. And then that kind of led to the idea of, oh, wow, maybe the interest in this is so strong, maybe I can build a business out of it. And then I did an ebook. I wrote an ebook, and I was in the process of creating a course. And then I just got a flurry of emails from people saying, "Hey, I want to be an Ikigai coach or a certified Ikigai coach. Do you offer a program?" And I was thinking, okay, that's weird. I mean, the first person who sent me this was a lady in Dubai. And I'm going, look, there wouldn't be a certified course in Japan because it's just a normal word. You can just do what I've done and research it. And then, yeah, I just got all these emails. And then I spoke to my business mentor and was sort of said to him, how does one certify a course? You can't just make a course and certify it, can you? And he said, that's exactly what you do. And he sort of explained the difference between accreditation, where you need some organizational body to approve what you're doing, but you can certify your own course. And I was a bit hesitant because I thought, is this ethical to take a cultural aspect and intentionally make money out of it? But I spoke to the professors I interviewed and they were very supportive. And my business mentor said, look, you studied this, you know what it means. You're the one person who should do this. And so, yeah, that's how my coaching program on this sort of evolved. So that's it in a nutshell. Yeah.
That's really lovely to hear how authentic it sounds, which it should be.
Yeah.
But yeah, your thoroughness.
Yeah, that's been important. I really love Japan. So, yep. I mean, how do I say this? So I guess the truth matters, or respecting the culture, but also I love sharing the culture. And also, I mean, as you guys know, that story of the Venn diagram's really interesting. And so part of what I do is trying to bring clarity to that, because the original creator of that Venn diagram gets no credit for his creation. And there's also lots of speculation as to how he came about that. So there's this fascinating story how the purpose Venn diagram became IKIGAI. And I do think that Venn diagram's helpful, it's inspiring. It's just not IKIGAI. So that's the story I'm sharing. Yeah.
So it's probably a really difficult question to answer, but what would be the key thing that makes the true Ikigai different from what is the Venn diagram missing? What's the biggest thing that it's missing, would you say?
Yeah, it's become an easy question now after many months. So we see in the West, Ikigai as a spectrum, or not as a spectrum, as a sweet spot, that if you're doing something that you love, that you're good at, that you can be paid for, and that the world needs, if you hit that sweet spot, you've found your Ikigai. And so it's limited to your work or your career. But in Japan, it's a spectrum. So it's a spectrum of all the things that make your life worth living, from small things in a daily life context. And it can include life-defining goals or the pursuit of life-defining goals, but they're meaningful goals. But for most Japanese, they would find Ikigai, in their hobbies or in their relationships or in the small things. As you probably know, I mean, a lot of Japanese live very stressful, hard-working lives. And so their Ikigai could be, Ken Moggy talks about this, and he's a sort of a celebrity neuroscientist, and he's written a book about this. He talks about how Ikigai can be, your morning cup of coffee or your morning walk or something small, and that if you have many of them, it's robust, and that if you have a bad morning and you miss your coffee or you're having just a bad day, you can have all these other different sources of Ikigai that help you get through the day. So it's not this life goal as such to achieve. It's this appreciation of all these things that make your life worth living. And through the research that I've done on Ikigai and research related to Ikigai, but in a Western perspective, there's something called the 5 Regrets of the Dying that you may know of.
Yeah,
by Bronnie, I think it's Bronnie Ware, who was an Australian nurse in palliative care. And one of these regrets was working too hard. And so the risk of the Venn diagram is this idea where working really hard to achieve this sweet spot. And I think it has a place, maybe the people I know and I've worked with that use it, they often use it for teenagers or young adults as a way to give them guidance to find a suitable career path.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you guys would know that eventually our work, our meaningful work, goes beyond doing something that we love. And it's, if we restrict it to what we're just good at, we wouldn't grow. And it really isn't tied, it's tied to our relationships and our roles. So it's, yeah, it's almost, in some ways, it's really the opposite of this Venn diagram. It's about these small things, your meaningful relationships. And it's usually something quite private and personal that, you know, you don't even have to share with someone else. It could be just a hobby, it could be a craft. And then it goes back also to Japan in the 1960s had their own literature boom on Ikigai. And there was a lady called Kemp who really wrote the first book on Ikigai. And she was this amazing woman who spent she spent her teenage years in Geneva, where she learned French. After World War II, she lived in America, so she became fluent in French, English. She became a translator. She translated Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. She tutored the Empress. She became a professor. And she desperately wanted to write. And so she wrote this book, Ikigai ni Tsuite, and it's only not in English, in Japanese. But her group, her study group, were Japanese lepers. And Japanese lepers were treated like lepers. They were shipped off mainland Japan. They were sent to detention-like centers on islands. And she wanted to study them to find out, how do people have the will to live, or how do people find meaning in their lives when they're struggling? So that was really one book that started the Japanese literature boom. And there were many books written after that by Japanese psychologists and authors. And what's interesting, even among Japanese, how they define Ikigai is different. So there's someone like Ken Mogi, who's written the Little Book of Ikigai a few years ago, and he describes it as this spectrum of things. And there's other authors from the 60s, 70s, and 80s who will say, you know, Ikigai is more about self-actualization. And the structure of the word Ikigai, gai is really a suffix. So there are other Japanese verbs that use gai. So if we wanted to say, you know, if we wanted to think about a word more appropriate for the Venn diagram that's Japanese, it would be hataraki gai. So the verb hataraku means work. And then you add gai, hataraki gai becomes the value of work, or the meaning you find in work. The verb, excuse me, I'm talking too much. And then the verb asobu, which means to play, is asobi gai, the value in playing. So there's one author who says, you know, your ikigai can't be your work. It can't be your hobby. It's something more. So there are, different opinions on what it means by Japanese scholars. Yeah.
I think for me, what you're doing here is kind of unwrapping something really interesting, which is this whole difference between being and doing. I think there's such a big drive, and I'm sure the Japanese culture feels this because clearly they do a lot of doing. There's a huge amount of doing, particularly from a work perspective. But I think for me, what's kind of evolving here and emerging from this this conversation is this difference between being and doing. I think what we're trying to establish here then is something that is a lot more about, you know, really wholesome, authentic, real daily habits, if you like, which include that kind of gratitude that you're talking about for those little simple moments, rather than it is that great big aspirational life goal, you know, the rah-rah thing that I know that you're not very keen on in terms of that kind of sort of principles of how you self-develop. I think that's really where we're going with this, isn't it? This is much more about the simplicity of being rather than the complexity of doing.
Yeah, so one thing, I mean, you're spot on. One thing about the Japanese is their ability to be present. So they're far more present in their daily activities than I think Westerners are. And if you've ever been to Japan, you'll see this everywhere. So if you go to a convenience store, you are 100% served, and they're focused. They'll serve you. If you go out to dinner with friends, they'll tend to talk less and just really enjoy the meal. I always have this kind of cheesecake story. So I think in the West, you know, we'll get a big piece of cheesecake, and after eating it, we're probably wanting a second piece. Whereas in Japan, they'll get this really thin sliver of a slice, but they'll really enjoy it and be really satisfied and happy after eating it. So they have this ability to be present. They really appreciate things. And something I was talking about with an author this week is their way of accepting the world. They're much better accepting the reality of the world and moving on, rather than maybe us, where we get more emotional and upset and angry and the injustice of this and that, and we want to say our piece. We want to, you know, if we're angry, we want to say something. So Japanese have this softer, calmer, more focused approach, and they're not driven by this desire to, you know, announce their goals or talk about things. They'll just kind of be in tune with life, as you're sort of pointing out, and be as well as do, but they're really good at being.
The trouble is, this is going to make me want to go to Japan even more than I already do by you talking, because it's one of the places I've always wanted to go to and go up climb the mountain, and so it sounds wonderful. I can feel it from you, what you're saying.
I mean, going there as a tourist is, I've never heard anyone who's gone there say it was a bad experience. Everyone seems to enjoy the hospitality that Japanese offer, and everyone has a unique story or something they're just stunned by. You'll ask for directions, and the person will walk you. Instead of just telling you, they'll actually walk you where you want to go, and it might take them 5 minutes. Or speaking to this person yesterday, and he said he would get in a taxi, and the taxi driver, if he couldn't find the place, because in Japan they don't have street names and it can be confusing, he would park the car, stop the meter, get out of the car with him and speak to the locals to try and find this restaurant. So this idea of service and delivering the service is, I mean, something we think is amazing, because they actually go that far to deliver what they've promised. But to them, they're really just doing what they think is expected of them. But I mean, at the same time, it's not all positive. And when I think about Ikigai in the context of Japanese culture, you know, there are millions of Japanese who don't have Ikigai. and they have these unique social problems that are just, they're devastating. They're so sad. And one example you may know of is hikikomori, which is social isolation, where usually young men decide not to engage with society, and they're usually living at home, or they're always living at home, and they might be in their early 20s, and they just decide not to come out of their room. So they'll have the internet, maybe PlayStation, and just one day they say, I'm not going to university anymore, or I'm not going into work anymore. And it goes from days to weeks to months to years. And there are documentaries on YouTube where you'll find someone's been living in their bedroom of their family home for like 20 years. And it's a widespread problem of millions of men doing this. And it's becoming so bad. There's another problem coming out of it called they call it the 80-50 problem, where these men who have spent 30 years of their life at home, not working, dependent on their parents, they're now 50, but their mother, maybe their father's died and their mother's 80, and she's frail and she can't look after herself. But this man's incapable of looking after her. He can't go outside and function. So there are, I want to be transparent and true that this Ikigai thing, not all Japanese have it.
Yeah.
And all these sacrifices they made in the 70s and 80s and 90s to be the sort of dominating global economy that they once were, came at a price of social or interpersonal relationships and family values. And there are many other problems. A lot of people in Japan die alone. So three men every hour die alone in Japan. And there are now cleaning companies that specifically go and clean the apartments or homes of people who've died alone. And these stories of how the manager of this company will ring up a family member and say, look, your father died. There's all these, there's furniture there, all these things. Do you want to come and collect them? And these families say, no, don't want anything, and don't want anything to do with it. So there's certainly a lack of Ikigai in Japan.
Sounds quite extreme. I know there was a program, I can't remember exactly what it was called, on television over here, and we watched it, didn't we? Do you remember? And I suppose at the time, because I so wanted to always go to Japan, I was quite shocked at the contrast that you're describing, because it showed, and I probably won't use the right terminology, but they were using a phrase for a typical Japanese man who has an office job and it's really revered. And they were saying that some companies will send young Japanese men to this school, and it showed the school, and it showed all of the really stringent, strict rules and behavior, a real boot camp. And I was because to me it kind of went against what I thought, you're describing, and I'm Reiki trained, Western Reiki trained, so it kind of went against that. And I was like, well, but how can it be one thing and then this? Because it seems so strict, and it seems so kind of damaging to their self-worth, because if they didn't pass the end of this boot camp, they would go back to their jobs and be either kind of sacked, or they would be completely demoted and not thought of well at all. And I kind of just thought, oh my goodness, that's just so strict. But how can it be so extreme?
There's a few, there are aspects of the culture that are hard to understand, and there are there's horrible stories of what you've just mentioned, where an employee is not considered valuable, but they won't fire him they'll demote him to a useless role until he decides to quit. Or
Yeah.
you hear these stories where they'll have an employee sit at the entrance and do nothing, and they're forced to greet all their co-workers every day, and at the most they might copy paper or something. And yeah, I mean, their workplace cultures, it's pretty brutal. And I think one of the benefits was they had lifetime employment,
Yeah.
which they don't have anymore. So
Okay.
that's a problem. And I mean, all these horrible stories of death by overwork, which they have a word for, karoshi. So they have these unique problems that just seem bizarre, but they're so widespread. They have a significant impact on society there.
I suppose.
And unfortunately, I'll just say this quickly. Unfortunately, Japan, they don't put a lot of money into helping people with these problems. So in Australia, we have so much money put into programs and advertising for depression. We have things called Beyond Blue, or we have a day for men to speak out. We have all these things, but in Japan, they have very little of that. And so these people, suffer in silence because there's a lot of shame associated to having any kind of social problem, or they kill themselves.
It's ironic, isn't it? But I guess across the whole planet, there are all these examples of where there's light, there's also dark, and it's those extremes. Because the Ikigai, coming back to it, the way you've described it, just sounds like such a wonderful thing to be in connection with your truth throughout your life, seeing that in all the simple things as well as what you do for a living. Because if we could all be in touch with that all the time, we would see the value and have gratitude for all those simple things, wouldn't we?
There's a really fascinating thing going on here, isn't there, between this whole thing about kind of, it sounds like from the Japanese culture, kind of being part of a whole, so kind of almost like doing away with the ego and sort of like self-identification, saying, look, no, you serve, you're part of what you contribute to a bigger whole. And this whole thing that we're creating in the West, which is, no, it's all about you, identify with yourself, find yourself, drive forward with this lovely purposeful life. And it's kind of, it's a real mess, I think, really.
Yeah.
Because they're very different things, aren't they? I mean, it's just when you use that word spectrum, for me, that kind of really opened up the whole thing for me, which, yes, it can be one end of the extreme where it is all about you, identifying, coming through your own personal chaos and kind of figuring out what your purpose is. You've used the word purpose. But at the other end of the spectrum, maybe this is the journey. And I know someone wants to ask you about the evolution of your Ikigai through life in a minute. But maybe as you kind of have found your purpose and then you start to serve and give, you realize, actually, it is more than just about me. It's actually about my part in society and actually about the greater whole. So there's this real kind of juxtaposition, isn't there, between the two kind of moments, if you like, of Ikigai. Do you see it that way?
Absolutely. I mean, you've hit a very important cultural aspect, that Japanese, this group mentality is crucial to their way of life and having harmonious relationships. So there's less focus on the individual and far more focus on group harmony. And that's something they learn at a very young age and something they strive to maintain. And there's an expression that the nail that sticks out gets hammered down, sort of related to that idea. So yeah, the individual or the individual needs or the success of the individual is not something Japanese really think about. They think about group, and they think about how their actions impact others. And then sort of the advantage to how they approach Ikigai is they approach it very casually. It's not a goal to achieve, so there's no stress associated to it. We set it as this pretty hard goal to achieve. I mean, it's either your, if you think about it, it's either your dream job or maybe becoming an entrepreneur to really achieve that sweet spot. Where for Japanese, how they get through their stressful work days is through these little things that they are present in and appreciate, far more than maybe we do. And, my wife, she seems to, when I think about it, just appreciate smaller things than I do. So it's valuable to me. And she has these little crafts or these little, it's like her me time where she's on her own doing these things. It really seems to help her get through, her life here, because she's living in Melbourne, and it's probably not home for her really. So that's something really valuable, I think, for the audience to think about. Is there's this stress-free, casual approach to Ikigai, where it is your hobby or a relationship or your kids or connecting with nature, where you don't have to achieve anything. It's like you're uncovering the things that give your life meaning. And then if we're talking about purpose, it's usually tied in with a role rather than a goal. So if you guys help people with mindfulness, if you tie that into a role and it's linked to your values and you're expressing your values through your role, you'll actually feel a sense of purpose. Mm-hmm. And there's a word in this book that this lady writes. It's called Shimei-kan, sense of purpose. So Shimei is purpose and kan is feeling or perception. And that's how she defined Ikigai using Ikigai and Ikigai kan. And so Ikigai would be an object or a source. And so she was a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So her book wasn't a self-help book, it was an in-depth study. And so an Ikigai source could be a relationship, it could be a family member, it could be a hobby, it could be an aspect of your work, it could even be a memory, a past role or teenage memories. And then Ikigai kan are these feelings you have associated to that Ikigai object. So a good example for me would be my son. He's an Ikigai source, and I have feelings of love, pride, a sense of purpose as a father, connection, and pride in the young man he's becoming. And so that's how we should probably perceive Ikigai as, we have all these potential sources of Ikigai, and related to each one, we have multiple feelings. And if we think about them like that, we probably develop this appreciation of them, rather than thinking, it's got to be this goal I achieve. So it's been a journey for me to uncover all this, and I've only really scratched the surface.
The conversations really helped me, because I think in my own personal words, it feels like Ikigai is not an answer, it's an enabler. Because like you were saying with your son, so certain things I choose to do in my life enable me to exhibit a certain principled behavior. So I haven't even thought about this before, but while we've been listening to you, something that I do in my life, which we talked about the other day, is I've always liked to look after things, whether it's shoes, because I've got lots of shoe boxes on top of my wardrobe, which are like 20, 30 years old, because they're still really good shoes, and I keep them in their shoe boxes. And I hate it when I see people discard things that they just don't want anymore because they're not in fashion, or they're not, because technically they're still good. And I see something throughout my life, and you and my daughter Macy say to me that I'm much slower to do things than maybe you are, and I am. And then I say, but I don't want to be quick, because I want to be thoughtful when I'm doing something. It just feels more my pace. But I think you've helped me to think that I think it's linked to that longevity thing that I don't know, it's just something in me that I need to kind of respect things and look after them so that they can have a long life and appreciate them. It's kind of a principle thing. And also spatial things. So in the home, I'm very neat and tidy, and I know to other people that can come across as a bit of OCD, but to me, I've realized, I've worked out that it's actually a mental way of being for me, because I have some challenges processing information. So when I have order in my home, it helps me to get clarity of mind, but it also has it's an energetic thing. I just feel that things feel right when they are positioned or space is cleared. So I think in lots of ways I can now see that there are certain ways of being that I do throughout my relationship, my work as a healer, or a coach, that I do through all of them. Does that make sense? It's almost like a common thread. So I don't know whether that is kind of indicative of what you're saying, but
no, I mean, it makes sense in the context of Japanese culture and Ikigai, because the idea of doing something properly is important in Japanese culture, and they have a word for, well, they have a Zen term called Ichigyo Zanmai, and it means one action, one focus. So it's very similar to single task focus. And when you do something properly, when you clean a room or put something in its proper spot, you have this sense of completeness and almost, you can relax.
Yeah.
And they have another word, it's one of my favorite words, called chuto hampa, and it means half done, half baked, half assed. And we all know when we don't do something properly, there's this feeling, there's this, we'll know, we'll try and avoid it and move on to doing something else that we won't do properly. And the point is, if you decided to, take the time to do things properly over 5 years, and then you decided, I can't be bothered, I'll just do things half-assed for 5 years, you'd end up being a very different person. And then taking that to the extreme, there's a word called Kodowari in Japanese, which means, doesn't always have a positive meaning, but in this context, it does, and it means paying great attention to the fine details of your work or whatever you're doing. And Ken Mogi writes about this. And this is very typical of Japanese craftsmen, where they're already delivering something, a high quality product that most people are very, very happy with, but they seek to refine it and make it better just because they have this desire to, and also in large part to serve their client, but not for personal recognition. They just want to do it. They have this love for it. And so if we could bring that aspect to our work or to our hobbies, where we're doing it really because we want to, and in a way for ourselves, for satisfaction, that's I think that relates to what you're talking about, where you have this need to take your time with things and do things properly and put them in their place, and you're not rushing to throw things out to buy something new. Yeah.
And it creates a sense, in me, it just creates a sense, like you said, of a feeling of, calm and So it's funny, isn't it? So thank you. You've helped me to see something very different, an underlying life principle almost, or behavior maybe, through what I thought was Ikigai being one thing. I think that's the other difficulty with the word in the West, is that when we talk of, your Ikigai, it suggests it's one thing.
Yeah.
Isn't it? But clearly it's not. It can be lots of little things, or a common thread, or this spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's interesting about Japanese, the language. There are no plural nouns. So that might create the perception it's one thing. And I mean, even Gordon Matthews, who's this guy, Gordon Matthews, if there's one book to read by a non-Japanese author, it's this book by Gordon Matthews, What Makes Life Worth Living. He interviewed he lived in Japan, so he interviewed 52 Japanese and 52 Americans on Ikigai. He was living in Japan and stumbled upon the word. And as an anthropologist, he realized he could do a study on Ikigai and do a dissertation. So his dissertation was interviewing all these people, and then he wrote his book and kind of condensed it. But he really has this perspective, it's most likely one thing. And he's probably one of the few Westerners who've studied it. So not everyone agrees on what it means. I mean, he sort of says conceivably, yes, it could be more, but he thinks, for him, he was talking about, how he's at work one day, almost in a heated discussion with another professor about something, and halfway through it, he just stopped and said, "This doesn't matter to me. Why am I getting sucked into this debate? I really don't care about it." And he kind of thought, the only thing I really care about is, my wife and my relationship with my wife. And so that was, his perspective. It is something significant. And I think it's both. I think you can have this spectrum, and in the core, you could have something related to a role that's related or relevant to, where you are. So if you're a young 20-year-old, yeah, you're probably looking for a role related to your work, where you're looking for a job where you can, hopefully you've finished uni and you're looking for a job related to what you've studied, and it's going to be well paying and it's going to give you all these opportunities. And then maybe in your 30s, you become a parent, and then your Ikigai source will be your child. And so you'll want to be a good parent and spend more time at home. Maybe before that, you'll fall in love, and so your partner will be your Ikigai. And then as you get older, maybe it's your work, and then you retire, and it's hobbies, and then it's grandkids. So it changes over time. So it can't be just one thing forever and you've achieved it and that's it. But I think, if your Ikigai, let's say, is your partner, and for whatever reason they leave you, if you've invested all your Ikigai, let's say, into that person, Kamiya Miyako writes about this. She calls it a collapse of your value system. And so let's say love, truth, honesty, loyalty to one person meant everything to you, and that person did everything opposite and was cheating on you, lied to you, then yeah, you're going to be pretty unhappy for many years. Whereas if you have multiple sources of Ikigai, maybe a relationship breakup or a loss of your job, you might be able to get through life with all these other things that give your life meaning. But one of the best quotes Gordon talks about, I'm trying to remember, he said, Ikigai is not the end of a life worth living, but the very beginning. So once you understand what you value and care about, you've got all these things to enjoy and appreciate. Yeah, so that's a better way to look at it.
So for this journey, I can just imagine. I mean, to be honest, this is absolutely fascinating. I think the three of us could kind of just do this all day, couldn't we? So, but if somebody was listening to this and thinking, "Oh, right, now I get it. Now I really understand the differences between these various kind of interpretations of this concept. Let's just call it a concept for a minute." and they want to take this up a little bit more kind of with you. I just want to focus a little bit on IKIGAI Tribe, because that is something a little bit special, isn't it? This kind of global community that you're kind of creating. How would people find out about that, maybe tap into it?
They can go to ikigaitribe.com. I've also got my podcast, so they can listen to, I just call it the Ikigai podcast. I've just actually published an episode today, and that's what I really love doing, and what we're doing. You know, you have these fascinating conversations with strangers, but you end up feeling like you're friends by the end of the call. So yeah, that's really what I'm doing, and I have this coaching program where I'm having these calls with people from all parts of the world, and what I try to do is create a environment of trust so that everyone gets to share and share their life and their opinion and their thoughts. So it's not just me presenting 2 hours of content. We reflect on these aspects of Ikigai. We look at the work of Kami and Miyako and other authors, and it gets quite emotional and personal, and it's been life-changing for me. So it's a real privilege and joy to be doing what I'm doing and doing stuff like this, talking to you guys.
Yeah, it's been
And
really fascinating.
Yeah,
Absolutely,
really
really so grateful for your time and wisdom on this, because, you know, I think for both of us, I speak for Sonya here, I think, you know, you've done a number of different perspectives here that we just haven't really considered. So I think, yeah, it's been really, really valuable, and I know people listening to this will be trying to search you down here to find out more. So thank you so much for your time today. It's been really, really good.
No, thank you guys, and thank you for being for so receptive to understanding it and learning what it means in the context of Japanese culture. And yeah, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome.